Troy. The name itself just echoes through history. It's the city that's been immortalized in epic poetry and myth. But what's so cool is that behind all the legends of gods and heroes, there's a real place. It's a mound of earth in modern-day Turkey that holds thousands of years of secrets. Okay, let's dive into this incredible story of discovery. For most of human history, that's all Troy was. Just a story. Homer's epic tale of love and war? It was just that, a tale. The idea that a real, physical city was actually buried out there somewhere, just waiting to be found, that seemed like pure fantasy. And that, right there, is the big question. It's what has obsessed treasure hunters, scholars, and dreamers for centuries. Did a great Greek army really sail across the sea and lay siege to a magnificent city? Well, to answer that, you first have to find the city itself. And that's exactly where our detective story begins. To really get why people were so obsessed with finding Troy, you have to understand the power of the story that kicked the whole thing off. The Trojan War wasn't just some random conflict. It was the defining myth of the entire ancient Greek world. Every clue, every single motivation for digging, it all starts right here. The source material tells us that Troy's incredible fame is almost entirely thanks to this myth. Seriously, without the story of Achilles and Hector and Helen, the hill we now know as Troy might have just stayed an anonymous mound of dirt in the Turkish countryside. So how do you go from an ancient book to, a bulldozer? Well, it takes a huge shift from myth to a real-world quest. And this one was driven by some very determined and, frankly, very controversial people. Now, what's really interesting here is the dynamic between these two guys. You have Frank Calvert, a local English diplomat, who actually had the right idea first. He's the one who correctly pinpointed this hill called his Sarlik as the site of Troy. But it was the wealthy German businessman, Heinrich Schliemann, who had the money and, more importantly, this single-minded obsession to start digging on a massive scale. His goal was simple, almost absolute. He was going to prove the Iliad was fact, not fiction. And wow, this image tells you everything you need to know about his methods. Schliemann was not a modern archaeologist, not by a long shot. He was in a hurry. He cut this enormous trench right through the center of the mound, literally blasting through anything that got in his way. In his rush to find the Homeric layer, the source tells us he basically destroyed layers and layers of history from later periods without even documenting them. It was brutal, for sure, but it was a very effective way to get to the bottom, fast. But here's the thing. What Schliemann and the archaeologists who came after him found was so much more complex and fascinating than just a single lost city. It was a puzzle, like a giant historical layer cake. And this became the brand new mystery. Okay, he'd found a Troy, but which one was the Troy from the legend? It turns out the answer was not simple at all. Just let that sink in for a second. Not one city, but 9. Over 4,000 years, Troy was destroyed and rebuilt again and again, with each new city rising directly on the ruins of the last one. Archaeologists label them with Roman numerals, all the way from Troy I, the earliest, up to Troy IX, which was the Roman city. This diagram is pretty much the key to understanding the whole site. Think of it like a map of time. Each one of those colored sections represents a different phase, a completely new city with its own walls, houses, and its own unique history. The crucial point here is that to find Homer's Troy, you have to find the right layer in this stack. So now the real archaeological detective work begins. Let's start looking at the evidence and see how this hunt for Homer's city actually played out, layer by layer. Schliemann had his number one suspect. When he finally got down to the layer we now call Troy II, he was absolutely convinced he'd found it. And why not? It had everything he was looking for. Signs of incredible wealth, evidence of destruction by fire, and, most importantly, these massive fortifications. And you can totally see why he was so sure. I mean, look at these things. These imposing ramps and enormous walls looked exactly like the well-walled Troy from the Iliad. And then he found a spectacular stash of gold that he dramatically named Priam's treasure. As far as he was concerned, the case was closed. But, and this is a huge but, later on, much more careful dating revealed a massive problem. Troy II was destroyed around 2300 BC. The Trojan War, if it actually happened, took place around 1300 BC. Schliemann's city was a full 1,000 years too old. 1,000! He had found a magnificent, ancient city for sure, but it wasn't Priam's. This discovery completely reset the entire investigation. Schliemann's big mistake meant that the real candidates for Homeric Troy were actually in the layers above the one he had so triumphantly dug through. The focus had to shift to a much later period, the Late Bronze Age. Okay, so this is really the heart of the modern debate. It all boils down to two prime suspects, Troy VI and Troy VIA. On one hand, you have Troy VI. It fits the description of Homer's city perfectly. It's grand with these massive, beautiful walls, but it was probably destroyed by an earthquake. Then you have Troy VIA. It fits the story. It was poorer, much more crowded, but it shows clear signs of a siege and a violent attack at just the right time. This is the central puzzle. So, after more than a century of digging, where does that leave us? What does all the archaeology actually tell us about the legend of the Trojan War? And this right here is the great contradiction of Troy. Neither city is a perfect fit. You've got Troy VI, which looks like Homer's city, but seems to have been destroyed by nature, not by a Greek army. And then you have Troy VIA, which was destroyed by an enemy at the right time, but it really doesn't match the description of a magnificent, wealthy kingdom. So the crucial point is that the archaeological reality is messy. It doesn't neatly line up with the epic poem. And this is the bottom line, according to the source material. Despite all the arrowheads and scorch marks they've found, there is no smoking gun. There's nothing that definitively proves the city was destroyed by the specific Greek army that Homer wrote about. The link between the myth and the reality, it remains tantalizing, but it's still unproven. Which leaves us with one final big question. If we can't actually prove the Trojan War happened, why do these ruins still captivate us so much? Well, maybe it's because Troy shows us just how powerful stories really are. Maybe it doesn't matter if we ever find the smoking gun of the war. The search itself, with all the layers of history, the mistakes, the discoveries, has created a whole new story, one about our own unending quest to connect with a legendary past.